Welcome aboard our humble museum ship, my friends. For the low price of just $1,000 a person, we will take you on an in-depth tour of the iconic Mighty O. See the hangar bays, the bridge, and the legendary flight deck. You can only see sights like these here, or at the other 3 museum ships of this class, but you're already here, so see them here. You will really pay? I mean, of course you will. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. Come along then. Let's free you of your money. Adventure awaits. Wait, what's that you're saying? The Navy called and they're taking back custody of the ship, effective immediately? Why in the world would they do that? This ship hasn't even been in service for over a century, and I'm living aboard. They can't take my home. You've already checked with legal and they've confirmed they absolutely can? Well, frack, sorry folks, we cannot conduct our tour as planned today, and I must ask you to leave post-haste. Oh, and no refunds. That, my friends, is the quite possibly true story of how resource shortages during the later stages of the Sino-American War led to the reactivation of the museum ship that would come to be known as RIvet City in the capital wasteland. And we simply cannot talk about RIvet City without first taking an in-depth look at her inspiration, the USS Oriskany, the Mighty O, the O-boat, the Big Risk. The Mighty O was named after the Battle of Oriskany during the Revolutionary War and was one of the last vessels of the Essex class of aircraft carriers. The Essex class was produced from 1941 all the way to 1950 and comprised 24 historic hulls. In fact, 4 of these fine vessels, the Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, and Lexington, endure today in the form of museum ships. Pretty neat that I've actually been on one of these, not gonna lie. The O-boat was unique among her class as she would receive the love it or list it treatment. Before that was even a thing, she was torn down to 60% completion in a loving renovation and heavily modified to support the aircraft of a new era. She would receive a massively reinforced flight deck, Herculean elevators, hydraulic catapults, enhanced arresting gear, and a flashy new island design, hull blisters, and somewhat sadly, the removal of many of her anti-air armaments. At the conclusion of this process, the U.S. Navy would elect not to list the Mighty O, and would instead commission her into service in 1950 to the pride of New York Naval Shipyard. The Oriskany would serve for the better part of not 1, not 2, but 3 decades across multiple conflicts, including headliners like the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Over that time, she would play host to various aircraft, such as the F-9F Panther during the Korean conflict, a fighter bomber developed by Grumman before the Northrop merger. The Panther had the distinction of being one of the first successful carrier-based jet fighters, having taken her first flight in 1947. The Big Risk would also play host to Ling Temco Vought's A-7 Corsair II during the Vietnam War. And how can you not love a fighter that takes on the Corsair namesake? The Corsair II was an attack aircraft that first took flight in 1965 and would remain in service with the United States Navy until 1991, if you can believe that. Sadly, at least to me, the Oriskany never played host to the iconic F-4 Phantom, as her airframe was somewhat, ironically, far too heavy for the Mighty O. That being said though, there were plenty of saucy jet fighters Bethesda could have chosen to form the basis of their fighter. Alas, Bethesda elected to take a different approach with the P-80 Shooting Star. The USS Oriskany would be decommissioned in 1976 and would serve as a donor ship supporting the 4 Essex-class museums that survive to this day, such as the aforementioned USS Lexington, for a time. She would eventually be sold for scrap in 1995, but would not succumb to that fate thanks to the failures of capitalism. The company that had bought her never actually got around to scrapping her, so the United States government would go ahead and reclaim her and give the Mighty O a new life under the sea, as the world's largest artificial reef in 2006. She now guards the Pensacola Pass off the Florida coast at a depth of 212 feet and is home to a wide spectrum of marine life and the occasional intrepid diver. Unsurprisingly, I'm going to go out on a limb here and conclude that RIvet City would have very similar specifications to the Mighty O. So, an intact RIvet City would have a length of approximately 911 feet, that's 195 feet shorter than USS Gerald R. Ford for reference, and a displacement of 44,700 tons. That is less than half of the Ford's. She would have been crewed by around 3,460 sailors. That's a lot of vaults. And historically, she would have featured a fighter complement of 80 aircraft, but I only counted around 25 shooting stars on her deck and in the waters surrounding her. so I can't conclusively say that 80 is correct, but it seems like a reasonable figure to me, as long as we don't take into account the limited scale of the interior's 2 hangar bays. As far as speed goes, we have an interesting question here, as we know for a fact that RIvet City was rocking a fusion reactor as her power plant that was later stripped by the Brotherhood for use in the Prydwen. Whereas the Oriskany was still a conventionally powered vessel, assuming the fusion reactor would output significantly more buttercups than the Oriskany's power plant, I'm going to take the O-boat's max speed of 33 knots and increase that to 40 knots. Now, is that a reasonable assumption? Heck if I know. I mean, you're talking to a guy that just had to Google what exactly a knot is. Speaking of, fun fact for those who also don't know, a knot comes from a 17th century unit of measure created from a rope, knotted, at regular intervals that was attached to a piece of wood shaped like a slice of pizza called a common log. Then, I'm assuming, we as humans do, shortened the unit as much as possible and ended up with just knots. Neat. Finally, one simply cannot go into the specifications on a vessel like this without going into the sensors and armaments RIvet City ought to have been packing. RIvet City was once packing radar of the following configurations: air, surface, fighter, direction, fire control, along with height finding. She was additionally equipped with AA directors, although most of her AA guns would end up being removed from the time she entered service in 1951, with 8 5-inch guns, 28 3-inch guns, and 14 20mm guns, to just 2 5-inch guns in 1976 when she finished her career. RIvet City herself, though, obviously was either no longer packing any AA guns, or had long since lost them to the scavenging of time. Okie dokie then, on to the pros and cons, and boy howdy, are we going to be here a while. I sure hope you don't mind. Anywho, let's get into it by starting with the biggest of the pros. The concept is fire. A derelict aircraft carrier is cool enough on its own, but add to that the largest city in the capital wasteland, and you've got the potential for a masterpiece. I mean, think about what RIvet City could have been had the concept not been presented to us in 2008, when polygons and high-res textures were still at a premium. Rather than the flight deck being a barren space for playing what I assume to be kickball, the deck could have been lined with planters boxes filled to the brim with lush plant life that could have been used to feed her denizens. The island could have been much, much more than the guard barracks it is in-game, but rather could have been the palace of RIvet City royalty, with the mayor ruling from the scenic bridge high above the rabble below. Anyways, enough lamenting what could have been. I think you get the picture of what I'm saying here. Although the implementation in Fallout 3 was short of what I'd have hoped, it still makes a huge impact and is a sight to behold, at least from a distance. That's not to say she doesn't look imposing or anything from up close, just that the lack of detail from 2008 really shines through when you're in close proximity. That being said though, there are significantly more details here than might originally catch your eye. I for one really appreciate the verticality RIvet City shows here, particularly on the world model. There are multiple levels extending from just beneath the flight deck all the way up the island with various means of access. There are even some levels that require Dark Souls-esque parkour to access that have hidden ammo caches that the player can loot. So although there isn't much of a reward for exploring RIvet City's nooks and crannies, there is at least some, which is a lot more than I thought she had. Another thing I had never noticed is the water hose running from the aft hangar over the stern and into the Potomac below. It's a really nice detail that connects the water lab to, well, a source of water. Also, it looks like at one point there might have even been a plan to allow the player to exit the aft hangar via a hangar door, where they could have gotten a close-up view of said hose. In fact, the world model still retains the open door prompt, although sadly activating it does not transition you into the interior cell. On a similar vein, all around the waterline of the starboard side of the vessel, there are pipes for pumping water out of the hull, an easy to miss but greatly appreciated detail. And finally, unlike with the vastness of RIvet City's hull, the modeler did a really swell job of capturing the details of the island. From the crane, to the bridge, to the crow's nest, and everything in between, it all looks solid. Speaking of cranes, that's another conceptual pro. The idea of the city being protected by a massive drawbridge, if you will, really makes a lot of sense to me in addition to having that cinematic impact that Bethesda loves. It is a bit of a shame to me, though, that RIvet City security will move the catwalk into position and grant you access, without really so much of a how do you do. I mean, I'd have liked to have seen a much more stringent process before granting some rando access to your fortified city. I think Bethesda really could learn a thing or two from Obsidian here. Having to either pay your way or find another more creative way to obtain entry into New Vegas is a far superior journey. Heck, even the Covenant from Fallout 4 does a better job screening you for entry, and all they do is run you through the GOAT exam. Although now that I say that, the GOAT exam has about as much value as asking someone if they are a terrorist before giving them a secret security clearance. A real thing that the US government does, by the way, I kid you not. Although I sincerely doubt anyone in the history of that question has ever answered yes. Yikes. I think I might have ventured a little prematurely into con territory there. Oh well, it's about that time anyways. But first, my final pro. Even though she is called RIvet City, the modeler didn't go nearly as crazy with the rivets here in comparison to the rivet funfetti of Fallout 4. Although this is likely due to the technology limitations of the day, I still greatly appreciate that fact. But now let's start off the cons by immediately tackling the elephant in the room and name Rivet with another riveting rant. Let's start off with a 10-penny tower high view of the process of riveting and welding. Riveting is the process of fitting a metal rivet, or a metal shank with a flat head, through a hole running between two metal plates that is smaller in diameter than that of the head of the rivet. The rivet is then driven into the hole using the blunt force of a hammer, which causes the end of the rivet to expand, filling the gaps between the rivet and plate, creating a watertight seal and fastening the two plates together at a single point. This process is then repeated at regular intervals along each plate, forming a secure connection. Welding, in contrast, uses heat in order to melt the edges of each plate. The metal then mingles together and cools, forming a solidified bond known as a weld. This process is carried out along the entire length of the plate, rather than at fixed intervals. Okay, cool story, bro, but why does this matter, you might be asking? Well, I'll tell you why. Simply from the description of the riveting process, it's pretty easy to see it takes more work. You have to measure out the distances between each rivet, drill a hole in each plate at that location, then line both plates of metal up so that the holes are overlapping. Then you have to likely have a two-man team, one to hold the rivet in place, while the other drives it in with a hammer to insert each rivet. Contrast that with welding. There are no holes needed to be placed or drilled, and a single individual with a welder can work independently rather than needing a team. This presents two advantages to welding. One, welding is significantly less complicated and thus a faster process that requires less skilled labor in comparison to riveting. And two, as a consequence, is far cheaper. During World War II, when the Essex class was being built, using welding, as far as I can tell historically, skilled labor and cash money was extremely limited, as one would expect, a situation that would likely closely mirror that of the Fallout universe during the Sino-American War. So it stands to reason, at least to me, that those are also two reasons why RIvet City should not have been riveted. Additionally, there is the contrast between the joints themselves. With riveting, the joints are a series of points containing rivets, while welds are continuous joins that are comprised of the parent material. This similarly provides two more advantages to welding. The first being welding does not add the weight of thousands of rivets, and the second being the continuous nature of the weld creates a stronger bond between the plates, resulting in a more robust vessel. So in conclusion, welding is cheaper, faster, lighter, and stronger than riveting when joining the plates of a ship's hull. And thus RIvet City should have been named Weld City. Fight me. Okay, rant over. Let's get back into our regularly scheduled con programming. Starting with the fact she has no propellers. She should have 4. Rudder? None to speak of. Elevators? She should have 3. I count just 1. She also does not feature the hull blisters she should have, nor does she have an anchor or a catapult. On a similar note, the port side of the vessel has pretty much 0 detail. Each of these omissions on their own are maybe not so bad, but together it really paints a disappointing picture. Although I must admit, until I went looking for cons, I had no idea she was missing her props, rudder, or should have had a blister. And I'm sure the vast majority of you also did not notice this. Next, I'd like to point out that RIvet City's hull is in far too good of a condition considering she has been aground for 200 years. The first issue is, rather than being dark gray, she should be completely dyed red-brown with rust. The second issue is the apparent structural stability of the hull. That seems to be incredibly unlikely given what limited knowledge I have about the maintenance of museum ships. You see, museum ships have a huge problem when it comes to maintaining the hull of their vessel, and there are a multitude of methods that have been attempted in order to properly preserve them. Off the top of my head, I can think of 3. You can suspend the vessel on a keel block pedestal on land, encase her in concrete, or simply dock her. Each of these methods has advantages and disadvantages. Being suspended on land, for example, reduces the threat of barnacle buildup and rust, but faces structural challenges due to the missing force of the sea pressing in on the hull that is integral to the ship's structural stability. Concrete provides structural reinforcement while removing the vessel from the water, but due to the porous nature of concrete, water will actually seep into the pores and then rest against the hull. But when it seeped through the pores of the concrete, it actually leaches the acidity from the concrete, thus increasing the speed of corrosion. Finally, simply docking the ship, as RIvet City more or less has been, leaves the ship in the environment she was designed for, but from that same token, has the issue of requiring hull maintenance, which RIvet City clearly would not have been able to receive. Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, and I hope y'all didn't mind. But yeah, that's why the condition of RIvet City's hull bothers me so much. Anyways, moving on, let's talk about our flight deck. It's honestly a bit of a mess. For one thing, the damage to the aft flight deck that forms the barrier wall preventing the player from going where they want to go, where Bethesda doesn't want them, makes no sense. I can't think of anything that would have caused such localized damage. Can you? Then, there are the support pillars for the crane that are more than a little problematic. I hope somehow these were installed by the first settlers of RIvet City and not pre-war in nature, as they would clearly impede flight operations, making landing or taking off significantly more hazardous, heck, maybe even impossible. Finally, in relation to the flight deck, in a bit of a nitpick due to the 200 years of weathering likely making this idea kinda dumb admittedly, the fanboy in me would have really loved to have seen the flight deck retain some of its markings, to really sell you on the idea that you are in fact on the deck of an aircraft carrier. But wait, there's more. Much like with the Prydwen, it really gets my goat that RIvet City doesn't have any defensive armaments. I really would have liked to have seen some sort of Fallout phalanx system here. A cocky robo-brain attached to a turret, for example, would have been an awesome CWIS weapon. And I betcha if Obsidian had done Fallout 3, we might have even seen such a thing. They gave us a canine gun and a schizophrenic toaster. Truly a missed opportunity. Okay, while there are a lot more things that I could possibly say, I've been ranting and raving for over 5 minutes now, so I'm going to cut to the chase and bring out my finishing move. The choice of an Essex-class carrier makes absolutely no frackin' sense. We are talking about a 1940s design being used in 2077. Pretty dang ludicrous. Add to that the fact the model is barely modified from historical design, and yet we are supposed to believe she has a fusion reactor on board? You just do not change the power plant of a vessel like that without leaving a trace. It's ridiculous. And then you compound that issue by choosing a 1940s fighter to go along with it? RIvet City purely existed to be sunk. And at that task, well, I suppose she succeeded. Phew! I'm glad that's done. Now, before I call it a day, I'd like to explore RIvet City's decks with y'all. I'm sure nothing in there could disappoint me, right? Also, I promise to be brief. Let's start our tour at the lowest deck. Let's call it D deck, so we can add a nice layer of structure to this endeavor. On this level, you have, of course, the stairwell, a necessary evil, unfortunately, of 2008 game design with memory being what it was, and the muddy rudder, the city's poorly named watering hole. Not much to see here, as is the case with, well, most of the interior, unfortunately. But hey, there are some nice speakers on the wall, so there's that. Next up, we have C deck, which contains the hangar, midships, aft hangar, and gangway access. The hangar has been converted into a market, with an oddly holy roof, considering the flight deck is in good condition right above it, and is fairly spacious, and supports this function quite well. It's a little strange to me, though, not to see the odd fighter or two here and there, making me wonder how exactly the city's denizens removed them. I also noticed for the first time that the trash cans are marked with the number 7, perhaps indicating that RIvet City maybe could have been CV number 7? That's a thing, right? Anyways, the midships features a church. lower class residences, and my personal favorite location on the ship, the Preservation Society Museum. Featured here are some neat Americana historical artifacts, along with, much to my personal pleasure, a P-51 Mustang suspended from the ceiling. An odd choice to be sure, given the Mustang was a land-based fighter, but I'll let that slide, because it's awesome. Other minor but interesting details are the nicely done sprinkler valves, and the odd compartment with smoke rising from below, allegedly, I suppose, from the engine room. Very interesting indeed. Last but not least, the aft hangar holds the science lab, where the non-mad scientists work on cleaning up the water. Other interesting details of the lab include the non-functional aft hangar bay door and a well-hidden, at least from me, entry point into Deck B, so Dr. Lee doesn't have to interact with the riffraff. Moving on up to B Deck, we have the creatively named Upper Deck that contains high-class residential berths, in addition to the Weatherly Hotel and the ship's sick bay. And that's really truly about it. At the top, we have A Deck, or the bridge, which honestly isn't really a deck, but it's the entirety of the island. The bridge is essentially a glorified stairwell that contains the military functions of the city, with the first level being the rec room for the guards, the second being the barracks, the third being the armory, and the fourth level being what remains of the CIC maybe, turned into a meeting room. It's really quite a shame that there isn't, well, an actual bridge in the bridge cell. But hey, at least there are some neat exterior access points to the island. I really do appreciate that. Finally, we have the bow, which is really more of a dungeon than, say, a well-thought-out vehicle interior. In the bow, we have perhaps a commissary, and of course, the mad scientist's lab, complete with the dissected bodies and all the fixings. Not a great showing here, to be sure, but I do appreciate the fact that the bow is actually, flooded, and trying to navigate her halls underwater is a nice bit of immersion that I'd actually love to see more of. And that, my friends, concludes our tour of RIvet City. I'd really love to see what Bethesda could do without 2008's limitations. I've always found it really hard to navigate RIvet City with all of her various interior cells, all 8 of them in fact, really preventing me from generating a map in my head. And that's in addition to the limited texture set making each hallway look nearly identical to the last, but that's a ubiquitous problem in Fallout 3. Although perhaps I shouldn't be asking what Bethesda could do these days, but rather what the uniquely talented team behind Fallout 4 Capital Wasteland could do, given there is a far, far, far greater chance of their project coming to completion than Bethesda actually remastering something. Alright, that'll do it for me, y'all. I really hope you enjoyed your time here, and as always, thank you so much for your support. Spydingo, out!